In the winter of 1716, 14 of the wealthiest sugar plantation owners in colonial Brazil vanished over the course of 6 weeks. Their families searched desperately. The Portuguese colonial authorities investigated, but no trace of them was ever found. 3 months later, workers dismantling an abandoned sugar mill discovered something horrifying in the massive coal furnace used to process sugarcane. Human remains, 14 sets of them, charred beyond recognition but clearly human. And scratched into the furnace's iron door were 2 words in Portuguese: Esperanza, justice. The hunt for Esperanza de Lima would become one of colonial Brazil's most intensive manhunts. And when they finally found her, her confession would reveal a campaign of revenge so methodical and chilling that even the brutal plantation system would be forced to reckon with what it had created. Who was Esperanza de Lima? What drove her to such calculated vengeance? Before we descend into this tale of fire and fury, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below, because what you're about to hear is one of history's most terrifying stories of retribution. This is Epoch of Fear, where buried histories refuse to stay silent. Colonial Brazil in the early 1700s was built entirely on slavery and sugar. The Portuguese had established a brutal plantation economy along the northeastern coast, particularly in the regions around Salvador da Bahia and Recife. Sugar was white gold, and the enormous profits it generated came from the forced labor of enslaved Africans who were worked literally to death in the cane fields and processing mills. The mortality rate among enslaved people on Brazilian sugar plantations was catastrophic, averaging 5 to 7 years from arrival to death. Plantation owners calculated this into their business models, treating human beings as disposable resources to be consumed and replaced. The sugar mills themselves were industrial-scale operations, massive complexes with crushing machinery, boiling houses, and enormous furnaces that burned constantly during harvest season. The furnaces were fed with bagasse, the fibrous waste from crushed sugarcane, creating intense heat necessary to process the cane juice into crystallized sugar. These furnaces were dangerous, often claiming the lives of enslaved workers who fell or were pushed into them during the brutal work shifts that could last 18 to 20 hours during peak harvest. The heat was so intense that a human body placed inside would be reduced to ash within hours. Esperanza de Lima was born around 1685 in what is now Angola, in a village whose name was lost when Portuguese slavers raided it in 1699. She was 14 years old when she was captured along with dozens of others from her community. The Middle Passage that brought her to Brazil killed more than a third of the people packed into the ship's hold. Esperanza survived 3 months of hell in the ship's belly, arriving in Salvador da Bahia in 1700, purchased at auction by a plantation owner named Antonio Cardoso de Lima. He gave her the surname de Lima, as was customary, marking her as his property. Cardoso's plantation, called Engenho Santo Antonio, was one of the largest sugar operations in Bahia, with over 300 enslaved workers and a reputation for exceptional cruelty, even by the standards of a brutal system. Cardoso believed that fear was the most efficient management tool, that keeping enslaved people in a state of constant terror prevented rebellion and maximized productivity. He implemented punishments that were designed not just to hurt, but to traumatize. Public tortures and mutilations that forced all the enslaved workers to witness what happened to those who resisted or failed to meet quotas. Esperanza was assigned to work in the Casa Grande, the main house, as a domestic servant. This was considered a privilege compared to field work, and in some ways it was. But it came with its own horrors. Antonio Cardoso had a wife, Beatriz, and 3 adult sons, Manuel, João, and Pedro. All 4 Cardoso men used enslaved women as they pleased, treating them as property in the most literal and violent sense. Esperanza was 16 years old when Manuel Cardoso first raped her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter in 1702, a child with light skin and the unmistakable features of the Cardoso family. The baby was named Maria, and Esperanza loved her with a desperation born of having lost everything else. For 5 years, Maria was the only light in Esperanza's existence, the only reason to endure the daily brutality. But the Cardoso family saw Maria differently. As the child grew, Beatriz Cardoso became increasingly uncomfortable with having her husband's son's illegitimate child in the house, a constant reminder of the family's exploitation of enslaved women. When Maria was 5 years old, in 1707, Beatriz demanded the child be sold away. Antonio agreed, calculating that a light-skinned child would fetch a good price in Recife, where such children were valued as domestic servants. Despite Esperanza's pleading, despite her offering to work double shifts, despite her begging on her knees, Maria was sold to a plantation 300 miles away. Esperanza was forced to watch as her daughter was taken away in a cart, the child screaming for her mother, not understanding why she was being abandoned. Esperanza collapsed in the yard and had to be dragged back to her quarters. For weeks afterward, she barely ate, barely spoke, moved through her duties like a ghost. She learned years later, through the informal network of communication that enslaved people maintained across vast distances, that Maria had died at age. The plantation she had been sold to was one of the worst in Pernambuco, known for working even children to death in the cane fields. Maria had collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke during harvest season, and no one had bothered to help her. She died alone in the field, and her body was buried in an unmarked grave with dozens of others who had been worked to death that season. When Esperanza learned of her daughter's death in 1710, something fundamental broke inside her. The part of her that had endured, that had survived capture and the Middle Passage and years of brutality by holding on to hope, by believing that somehow she might see Maria again, died with her daughter. What remained was something colder, something that understood that justice would never come through legal means or divine intervention or the mercy of those in power. If there was to be any accounting for what had been done to her and thousands of others, she would have to create it herself. For 6 years after learning of Maria's death, Esperanza appeared to be the model of compliance. She worked efficiently, spoke respectfully, showed no sign of resistance. The Cardoso family stopped paying attention to her, seeing her as just another piece of household property, reliable and broken. But Esperanza was planning. She was observing, learning, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities. She was studying the network of plantation owners who socialized together, who were connected by business and family ties, who had all participated in and benefited from the system that had destroyed her life and killed her child. Antonio Cardoso was part of a social circle of 14 wealthy plantation owners who met regularly to discuss business, politics, and strategies for managing their enslaved populations. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Holy Sacrament, a religious fraternity that met monthly, ostensibly for prayer and charitable works, but actually to coordinate their economic and political interests. These 14 men controlled more than half of the sugar production in Bahia, owned collectively over 4,000 enslaved people, and wielded enormous political influence over colonial administrators. Their names were Antonio Cardoso de Lima, Manuel Andrade, Francisco Barros, Diego Costa, Bernardo Fonseca, Luis Gomez, Sebastião Henriquez, Tom Mendes, Rodrigo Neves, Cristoval Oliveira, Gaspar Pereira, Martinho Ribeiro, Joaquim Santos, and Vicente Tavares. The Brotherhood met in rotation at each member's plantation, elaborate dinners followed by private business discussions. Esperanza, working in the Cardoso household, had access to information about these meetings, knew the schedules, understood the patterns. She learned their habits, their roots, their vulnerabilities, and she began to formulate a plan that was audacious, probably impossible, but the only thing she had left to live for. She would kill them all All 14 men who sat in that brotherhood, who traded human beings and worked them to death, and raped and brutalized, and considered it all normal business practice. The key to her plan was an abandoned sugar mill called Engenho da Misericordia, located about 5 miles inland from the coast. It had been one of the most productive mills in the region until a fire in 1710 had damaged the machinery and killed several enslaved workers. The owner had died shortly after, and his heirs had chosen not to rebuild, letting the property sit abandoned. The complex deteriorated, its buildings becoming overgrown, its massive furnace cold and empty. But the furnace itself remained structurally sound, a huge brick and iron structure capable of generating tremendous heat. Esperanza had visited the site years earlier as part of a work detail delivering supplies before the fire. She had remembered it, filed away the information without knowing why it might be useful. Now she knew. The abandoned mill was isolated, rarely visited, and its furnace was the perfect instrument for what she planned. In early 1716, Esperanza began the active phase of her plan. She started by cultivating a relationship with a free African man named Thomas, who worked as a carter, transporting goods between plantations and the port. Tomas had his own history of loss and rage. His wife and children had been enslaved and sold away from him before he had managed to purchase his own freedom through years of backbreaking work. When Esperanza approached him carefully, testing his willingness to help, sharing her plan gradually, Tomas agreed without hesitation. He had his own reasons for wanting the plantation owners to suffer. The methodology Esperanza developed was simple but required perfect execution and extraordinary courage. She would approach each brotherhood member individually, using her position as a trusted household servant to deliver messages that would lure them to the abandoned mill. The messages varied slightly, but followed a pattern, claiming to have information about valuable property opportunities, or intelligence about enslaved people planning rebellion, or evidence of another plantation owner's betrayal. Things that would motivate these men to investigate personally and discreetly, without bringing guards or informing others. On January 15, 1716, the campaign began. The first target was Manuel Andrade, one of the younger Brotherhood members, less cautious than the older men, more prone to act impulsively on information that promised profit. Esperanza arranged for a forged note to be delivered to Andrade through channels that would not trace back to her, claiming that an enslaved overseer at Engenho da Misericordia had found gold deposits on the abandoned property and was willing to share the location in exchange for freedom. Gold was always a powerful lure in colonial Brazil, where gold rushes in Minas Gerais had created massive wealth. The idea that an abandoned plantation might sit on undiscovered gold was plausible enough to warrant investigation. Andrade rode to the abandoned mill alone on January 16th, not wanting to share potential gold with partners or alert competitors. He arrived in the late afternoon when the light was beginning to fade. Esperanza and Tomas were waiting, hidden near the furnace building. When Andrade entered the furnace building calling out for the overseer, who supposedly had information, they emerged from hiding. Tomas struck him from behind with a heavy wooden club, a calculated blow that stunned but did not kill. They bound Andrade quickly with ropes, gagged him with cloth, and dragged him to the furnace. Esperanza had prepared it earlier that day, stacking it with bagasse and wood, creating a pyre ready to be lit. Andrade regained consciousness as they were positioning him in the furnace's firebox, the large chamber where fuel was loaded. He struggled against the ropes, tried to scream through the gag, his eyes wild with terror and incomprehension. Esperanza looked at him directly, wanted him to see her face, to understand in his final moments that an enslaved woman he had never bothered to see as human was the instrument of his destruction. She did not explain, did not justify, did not give him the satisfaction of understanding why this was happening. She simply lit the fire. The bagasse caught quickly, flames spreading through the piled fuel, heat building rapidly in the enclosed space. Andrade's muffled screams intensified as the temperature rose. Esperanza and Tomas closed the iron door, sealing him inside, and secured it with heavy chains. The furnace roared as the fire consumed oxygen and fuel. They could hear Andrade's screams for perhaps 10 minutes before they stopped. They kept the fire burning through the night, ensuring complete cremation. By morning, when they opened the furnace, there was nothing recognizable left, just ash and bone fragments that they scattered in the surrounding forest. Andrade's horse, which they had hidden in the overgrown cane fields, they released several miles away, making it appear the animal had run off. When Andrade was reported missing, the assumption was that he had been thrown from his horse or attacked by bandits. Search parties combed the region, but found nothing. The abandoned mill was not even searched. No one thought to look there. The second killing occurred on January 23rd. Francisco Barros was lured with a message about rebellious enslaved people planning to poison their masters, information he would want to investigate before it became public. The third was Diego Costa on January 30th, told about a valuable shipment of African captives arriving secretly that could be purchased below market price. Each man came alone, motivated by greed or fear or the desire to maintain advantage over competitors. Each was ambushed, bound, burned alive in the furnace. Each disappeared without trace, their families desperate, authorities baffled. By mid-February, the colonial administration in Salvador was in crisis. 5 prominent plantation owners had vanished in a month. Theories multiplied wildly. Some believed a criminal gang was kidnapping wealthy men for ransom, though no demands ever came. Others suspected enslaved people were behind the disappearances, organizing some kind of coordinated uprising, though no evidence of organization could be found. Some whispered about supernatural causes, African sorcery, or vengeful spirits. Security measures were implemented. Plantation owners began traveling with armed escorts. Enslaved people faced increased surveillance and brutal collective punishments as paranoid owners lashed out. But Esperanza continued. She had to be more careful now, more creative in her lures, more patient in waiting for the right opportunities. But she continued. Bernardo Fonseca on February 12th, Luis Gomes on February 19th, Sebastio Henriquez on February 26th. Each man burned alive, each reduced to ash, each family left to wonder and grieve without closure. By early March, 9 of the 14 Brotherhood members had disappeared. The remaining 5 were terrified, barely leaving their plantations, surrounding themselves with guards. The colonial governor offered massive rewards for information, threatened enslaved populations with collective punishment if the disappearances did not stop. Esperanza knew she was running out of time. The increased security made it nearly impossible to continue. But she had 5 more targets, including Antonio Cardoso, the man who had owned her, whose son had raped her, who had sold her daughter to death. She would not stop until all 14 were dead, or until she was caught. She adapted her methods. For Tom Mendez on March 5th, she used information about his mistress planning to expose him to his wife, drawing him to the mill with promises of preventing scandal. For Rodrigo Neves on March 12th, she claimed to have evidence that another Brotherhood member was embezzling from their joint business ventures. The last 3 were the hardest. Cristova Oliveira, Gaspar Pereira, and Martinho Ribeiro were the most cautious of the group, refusing to go anywhere alone, suspicious of all messages and offers. Esperanza had to take risks. For Oliveira on March 19th, she personally approached him at a market in Salvador, pretending to be a messenger from the governor's office with urgent confidential information that could not be written down. He followed her to a location where Tomas was waiting. They took him by force in daylight, a desperate act that could have exposed everything. For Pereira on March 24th, they ambushed him on a road, overpowering his single guard and taking both men. The guard, who was himself enslaved and had no loyalty to his owner, was offered freedom if he helped. He agreed, and became the third member of Esperanza's conspiracy. With his help, they took Ribeiro on March 26th using similar methods. 13 men dead. 13 of the 14 Brotherhood members murdered and burned. Only Antonio Cardoso remained, and he was the most difficult target. He had barricaded himself on his plantation with a dozen armed guards, refusing to leave, refusing to meet with anyone he did not know personally. Esperanza could not lure him anywhere. She would have to go to him. On March 30th, she made her decision. She would kill Cardoso in his own house, knowing it would mean her own death, but accepting that cost. She had accomplished 13 murders, more than she had thought possible. If she could complete the 14th, her revenge would be total. She prepared carefully, obtaining poison from an enslaved woman who knew traditional African medicines. The poison was slow-acting, would take hours to kill, but was virtually undetectable in food or drink. On March 31st, Esperanza served Cardoso his evening meal as she had done thousands of times before. The poison was in his wine, carefully measured. He drank it without suspicion, without even looking at her. She was invisible to him, a piece of furniture that moved and served. After the meal, Esperanza did not try to flee. She waited in the slave quarters, knowing what was coming. Around midnight, Cardoso began to feel the effects of the poison: severe stomach pain, difficulty breathing, convulsions. His screams woke the household. Physicians were summoned, but could do nothing. Cardoso died in agony around 3 in the morning on April 1, 1716. The investigation was immediate and thorough. The symptoms suggested poisoning. All the enslaved people who had prepared or served food were questioned with brutal interrogation methods. Esperanza did not deny her guilt. When asked directly if she had poisoned Antonio Cardoso, she said yes. When asked why, she told them about Maria, about the 14 men, about the furnace. At first, they did not believe her. A single enslaved woman could not have killed 14 men. It was impossible. But Esperanza provided details that could be verified. She described the abandoned mill, explained how she had lured each man, provided information about their disappearances that only the killer could know. On April 3rd, authorities traveled to Engenho da Misericordia and searched the abandoned furnace. They found bone fragments, metal objects that had survived the intense heat, buttons and buckles and jewelry that could be identified as belonging to the missing men. They found the 2 words scratched into the iron door: Esperanza's justice. The full horror of what had happened became clear. One enslaved woman, with the help of 2 accomplices, had systematically murdered 14 of Bahia's wealthiest and most powerful men, burning them alive, and had evaded detection for nearly 3 months. The colonial administration's response was swift and brutal. Esperanza, Tomas, and the enslaved guard who had helped with the final killings were sentenced to execution. But the method of execution was designed as a message. They would be burned alive publicly in the central square of Salvador, in front of the entire city. The execution was scheduled for April 15th. Thousands gathered to witness it. Esperanza was brought out first, bound to a stake surrounded by wood. The crowd was mixed in its reactions. Some shouted for her death, calling her a demon and a murderer. Others were silent, recognizing that what she had done was a response to systematic brutality. Before the fire was lit, Esperanza was given a chance to speak, to confess her sins and beg for mercy. She declined mercy, but she did speak. Her words were recorded by several witnesses and later written down. She said, "I killed 14 men. I burned them as they burned my people, as they burned my daughter's life, as they burn all of us slowly in these fields. You call me murderer. I call myself justice. You built a system on our bodies and our suffering. I made 14 men feel what we feel every day, powerless, terrified, alone. I have no regret except that I could not kill more. My daughter's name was Maria. Remember her. Remember all the Marias you kill without counting. The fire was lit. Esperanza did not scream. Witnesses reported that she stared directly at the crowd, unflinching, until the smoke overcame her. Tomas and the guard were executed similarly. Their bodies were left on display for days as a warning to enslaved people about the consequences of resistance. But the warning had an unintended effect. Esperanza became a legend, her story spreading through enslaved communities across Brazil and beyond. She became a symbol of resistance, proof that the powerless could strike back, that the system could be challenged, even by those it most thoroughly oppressed. The 14 families of the murdered men tried to suppress the story, embarrassed that they had been outwitted by an enslaved woman, humiliated that their patriarchs had been killed so methodically, but suppression was impossible. The story was too dramatic, too shocking, too perfect as a narrative of revenge. It spread through oral tradition, was written about in letters and diaries, eventually appeared in histories of colonial Brazil, though often in sanitized versions that minimized the horror of what the plantation owners had done to provoke such revenge. Modern historians examining the case have tried to contextualize Esperanza's actions within the broader history of slave resistance in Brazil. Brazil imported more enslaved Africans than any other country in the Americas, approximately 4 million people between the 16th and 19th centuries. The conditions they faced, especially on sugar plantations, were among the worst in the Atlantic slave system. Resistance took many forms, including running away to establish quilombos or maroon communities, work slowdowns and sabotage, religious resistance through maintaining African spiritual practices, and occasionally violent rebellion. Large-scale rebellions, like the Mock Revolt of 1835 or the Quilombo of Palmares, were rare because they were almost always crushed with overwhelming violence. Individual acts of resistance were more common, but usually went unrecorded. Esperanza's campaign was unusual in its scale, success, and eventual documentation. She managed to kill 14 men over 6 weeks without detection, and lived long enough to confess and explain her actions, ensuring her story would be preserved. This required extraordinary planning, courage, and a willingness to sacrifice her own life for revenge. The psychological dimension of Esperanza's revenge is striking. She did not simply kill her targets. She made them experience terror and powerlessness, the same emotions enslaved people lived with constantly. She inverted the power dynamic completely, making men who wielded absolute power die helpless and alone, understanding in their final moments that they were victims of someone they had considered less than human. The choice to burn them alive was both practical, ensuring bodies would be destroyed, and symbolic, using the very instrument of sugar production that had consumed so many enslaved lives as the means of revenge. The confession and the public speech before execution served multiple purposes. Esperanza ensured her story would be recorded, that her daughter's name would be spoken, that the system's brutality would be publicly acknowledged even if not officially condemned. She denied her executioners the satisfaction of her repentance or fear. She transformed her execution into a political statement, a moment where the truth about slavery was spoken plainly regardless of consequences. And she became a symbol that would inspire others, proof that resistance was possible even for those most thoroughly oppressed. The question of Esperanza's morality is complex. 14 premeditated murders carried out with calculated cruelty is evil by any standard. Burning people alive is torture. The families of the murdered men suffered regardless of what their husbands and fathers had done. Children lost fathers, wives lost husbands. The grief was real, but context matters. Esperanza lived in a system that denied her all legal recourse, that had destroyed everyone she loved, that treated her and millions of others as property to be used and discarded. Her victims were not innocent. They participated in and profited from systematic violence that killed thousands. Does this justify what Esperanza did? That question has no simple answer, and probably depends on one's broader beliefs about justice, revenge, and violence in response to oppression. What is clear is that Esperanza's actions cannot be separated from the context of slavery. She was not a psychopath killing for pleasure. She was a person systematically brutalized who finally struck back. Whether her response was morally justified or not, it was psychologically comprehensible and politically significant. Her willingness to kill and die in revenge demonstrated that enslaved people retained agency, that submission was not acceptance, that the system created the very violence it feared. The location of Engenho da Misericordia, the abandoned mill where the murders occurred, became a site of complicated memory. After the executions, colonial authorities considered destroying the furnace entirely, erasing the physical evidence of what had happened. But the cost of demolition was deemed too high, and the property remained abandoned. Over the decades, it became part of local folklore, a haunted place where the screams of burning men could supposedly be heard at night. Whether these accounts reflect genuine paranormal activity or the psychological weight of knowing what happened, there is impossible to determine. The furnace itself gradually deteriorated over centuries, bricks crumbling, iron rusting, vegetation overtaking the structure. By the 20th century, little remained visible of the original buildings. In 1989, Brazilian archaeologists conducted a survey of the site, finding remnants of the furnace foundation and recovering artifacts including metal objects that might have belonged to the murdered men. These findings confirmed that the historical accounts were based on real events, though some details had been distorted through centuries of retelling. The question of memorialization remains controversial. Some historians and activists argue that Esperanza de Lima should be recognized as a freedom fighter, someone who resisted slavery through the only means available to her. They point to her courage, her planning, her willingness to sacrifice herself for revenge as qualities worthy of respect, if not celebration. They argue that remembering her story honestly, including its violence, is essential to understanding the full horror of slavery and the resistance it generated. Others argue that memorializing someone who committed 14 murders, regardless of context, sends dangerous messages about vigilante violence and revenge. They worry that treating Esperanza as a hero might inspire violence in contemporary contexts where people feel oppressed or wronged. They prefer to remember her as a tragic figure, someone driven to evil by evil, a cautionary tale about how brutality creates brutality in endless cycles. Most historians take a position somewhere between these extremes, acknowledging both Esperanza's suffering and her agency, her victimization and her crimes. What is generally agreed is that Esperanza's story reveals truths about slavery that are essential to confront. The system was not just economically exploitative, but comprehensively dehumanizing, destroying families, denying agency, creating conditions where some people would prefer to kill and die rather than continue submitting. The violence Esperanza committed was terrible, but it was a response to systematic violence on a much larger scale. Focusing on her crimes while ignoring the context is a way of avoiding the deeper moral questions about slavery itself and the society that created and maintained it. The 14 men Esperanza killed were individuals with families who loved them, but they were also participants in a system that caused immense suffering. They personally owned and exploited hundreds of people, separated families, worked people to death, committed or enabled countless acts of violence. Their deaths were tragic for their families, but their lives were built on thousands of tragedies they inflicted on others. This does not mean they deserve to be burned alive, but it means their deaths cannot be mourned in isolation from their actions. Esperanza's daughter Maria, who died at age 8 in the cane fields of Pernambuco, represents millions of people whose names are lost, whose suffering was never recorded, who died without anyone marking their passing. The only reason we know Maria's name is because her mother committed extraordinary crimes that forced the system to pay attention. How many other Marias died without their mothers being able to take revenge, without their stories being preserved, without any acknowledgement of their humanity? The answer is millions, and this is the true horror that Esperanza's story points toward. The legacy of slavery in Brazil is complicated and ongoing. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888, nearly 400 years after the system began. The effects of that long history of exploitation persist in economic inequality, racial discrimination, and social structures that continue to disadvantage the descendants of enslaved people. Confronting this legacy requires honest examination of slavery's brutality, including the violence it generated in response. Esperanza's story is part of that history and deserves to be remembered, not necessarily celebrated, but remembered as truth. In 2016, on the 300th anniversary of the murders, a group of activists in Salvador held a private ceremony at the site where Esperanza was executed, placing flowers and speaking her name and her daughter's name. A ceremony was not officially sanctioned and received little media attention. But for those present, it was a way of acknowledging that Esperanza's life and actions mattered, that she was not just a footnote in colonial history, but a person whose suffering and revenge said something important about the human cost of slavery. What do you think about Esperanza de Lima's actions? Was her revenge justified by what had been done to her and millions of others? Did she become as evil as her oppressors by adopting their methods of cruelty? How should history remember people who committed atrocities in response to systematic oppression? And what lessons from her story remain relevant today about justice, revenge, and the cycles of violence that oppression creates? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story challenged you to think about the complex moral questions surrounding resistance and revenge, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We explore history's darkest corners, the stories that make us uncomfortable, the events that challenge simple moral narratives. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that history is rarely simple, that oppression creates its own violence, that systems built on cruelty eventually produce terrible consequences. Esperanza's story deserves to be remembered, not to celebrate violence but to understand it, to recognize that the 14 men she killed were victims of her violence, but also perpetrators of systematic violence themselves. Her daughter Maria deserves to be remembered, along with the millions of other children destroyed by slavery. Hit that subscribe button. Join our community committed to honest historical reckoning, no matter how complicated or disturbing. And I'll see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe the truth matters even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The past shaped the present, and we cannot build a better future without honestly confronting what came before. In all its horror and complexity, Esperanza de Lima burned 14 men alive. Remember her. Remember Maria. Remember what drove them both to their fates.